Find Me in Your Dreams, a fantasy novel by Victoria Veles. We Are the Dreamers series. Book 1. Chapter 2. But You Can Only Dream. How I wished that my dreams held a deeper meaning. But truth be told, they were just dreams, nothing more, nothing less. My dreams often turned darker and scarier around the anniversary of my parents' death. I always dreaded this time of year, knowing what it would bring. I expected that night to be no different. To be honest, I usually couldn't even recall the details of the dreams I had. They were often just seemingly random images, usually involving some sort of dark shapes circling around me. I would try to hide from those dark shapes chasing after me, feeling so utterly scared and alone. But that night was different from my usual dreams. That night, I wasn't alone in those dreams. I wasn't alone with the monsters that were hunting me down. That night, there was that boy from the forest. I remembered lifting my head in my dreams at one point, wanting to understand why the monsters weren't trying to rip me to pieces. And I saw him standing there, right in front of me, shining like a bright light, dispelling the darkness around. Somehow, the monsters didn't come close with him there. His light was stronger than their darkness. All I could do was look at him in awe and be grateful that he was there, keeping the monsters at bay. Just for once, I wasn't alone with my darkness. And I was grateful to him for sharing his light. The next morning when I woke up, I could still feel the warmth of his light. It seemed to linger with me. Just being in his presence seemed to push away some of the monsters inside me. As if his light had chased them back into their dark caves, where they would hide in the light of day. Who was that boy? Was I finally losing my mind, crumbling under the lifetime of pressure? As I sat in my calculus class, I was trying to pay attention to the teacher, but I knew it was a losing battle. School was never particularly interesting to me, let alone on a day like this. I enjoyed learning but preferred to do so on my own terms, within the confines of my room. School just managed to chew up the knowledge and present it in the most useless and boring manner, stripping away all the joy from it. On top of that, I was never too keen on spending my days with other teenagers, who often seemed more interested in showing off in front of each other rather than in learning. All in all, school was a chore I had to endure. Sometimes, Nana would let me skip a few days. She seemed to understand my need for breaks from the constant buzz of the school environment. On those days, I cherished the solitude and silence of my room, which allowed me to decompress and enjoy a sense of peace. It was during these moments of quiet that I could clearly see how much tension I was holding on to. So instead of paying attention to the lecture, my mind was busily trying to decipher what had happened back in the forest and in my dream. The weird high-pitched sounds weren't part of the track. I listened to it again in my room that evening. The track contained only the narrator's soothing voice followed by the gentle melody of a flute and the sound of a stream. I was mentally debating whether I should go back to the forest and see if I could encounter the boy again. I kept on calling him a boy, even though he hardly looked like one. Calling him a guy just didn't feel right, it carried too many connotations. This particular guy had something boyish about him, not in his appearance, but in his demeanor. I couldn't quite explain it, but when I reflected on the dream and the feeling I got from being in his presence, I was reminded that there was something brighter, more pure in this world. For that brief moment, the world didn't seem like such a bad place to be in. That feeling lingered with me through the morning. It was such a comforting sensation. It was disappointing how it faded as the day went by. That was another reason I was determined to figure out what was up. I really wanted to get the feeling back as well as solve the mystery of the vanishing boy. I had to go back to the forest. I decided that I would do it after dinner. Once the class was over, Nora, my friend, approached me with an exasperated look. Man, could this class be any more boring? I had to recite the lyrics of Viva la Vida just to stay awake, she said. Coldplay has been one of her favorite bands for as long as I could remember. Nora was the only close friend I had in school since I've always been the type to keep to myself. Our friendship went back to when we were kids. My grandma's house and Nora's were just a few streets apart. I couldn't recall a time without Nora in my life. Our first meeting was probably too far back for me to have a clear recollection of it. I just remember that we would play when I visited my grandma, spending countless hours in our backyards, never bored in each other's company. After my parents' death, when I moved to my grandma's house, Nora was the only person who was there for me, not affected by my sour moods or my need for time alone. She never asked for more than I could give, and I think that's why our friendship has survived through the years. "Now those lyrics are stuck in my head," she complained, then sang the lyrics out loud, really overdoing it as if giving a performance for an audience. I silently clapped for her, exaggerating my actions as well. Nora had a wonderful voice, I have always admired it. She played along by giving a deep bow. I chuckled and looked around, making sure nobody was watching our small show. Nora was a mix of brains, charm, dedication, and ambition, with a confident air that drew people to her effortlessly. Her features carried the reminder of her South Korean roots as her parents immigrated when she was just a year old. Her face was delicate yet striking, her dark eyes sparkled with knowledge, and her smile lit up the room. She was super smart and worked hard, always at the top of her class. But underneath her serious side, she had a fun-loving spirit and a great sense of humor. She was approachable and easy to talk to, making everyone feel comfortable around her. In short, Nora was a smart, ambitious, and friendly person who wasn't afraid to be herself. Did you know that Chris Martin said this song was about a king who's lost his kingdom and reflects a theme on downfall of power? I think he mentioned that he drew inspiration from the reign of Louis XVI and the French Revolution. One day he was a king ruling the world, and the next day he was not. It's kind of an odd thing to write about in a song, but I like it. It's different, she added with approval in her voice. Nora was always full of odd facts and information that nobody else seemed to know about. Then she swung her arm around my shoulder and said, "I'll have to borrow your notes for this lecture, I'll never recall what happened during class." I responded sheepishly. I had a hard time keeping up with it myself. "What's going on in your head today?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. She knew me all too well. "Just the usual stuff," I said. I hesitated to share my recent fixation with her. My life was already filled with peculiarities without adding mysterious noises and enigmatic boys from my dreams to the mix. Besides, I was still trying to make sense of it all myself. But it seemed like a good opportunity to ask Nora if she had ever heard anything like that herself, considering our backyards bordered the same forest. "Hey, Nora," I began hesitantly as we made our way down the corridor to our next class. "What's up?" She looked at me, curiosity lighting up her eyes. "Ever heard a strange noise in the forest, a screeching sound?" My face twisted in an attempt to describe the peculiar noise. "Like a bird?" she queried. "No, not a bird. It's a continuous, high-pitched noise. Kind of like a radio that's not quite tuned right." "When did you hear it?" "Yesterday, I was in the forest. Walking," I said, opting not to mention my recent meditation attempts. "And then it just came out of nowhere. I can't figure out what it was." "Oh," she frowned. "I've never heard anything unusual there." "Maybe it was a 3G network," she suggested mockingly with a grin. I rolled my eyes. Nora was a huge skeptic, and any mention of conspiracy theories would set her off on a rant about how ridiculous it all was. "Very funny, Nora," I retorted grudgingly. I knew she wasn't making fun of me directly, but it didn't ease my concerns about my own sanity. Also, I might have seen someone in the forest who didn't look familiar. A boy, well, a guy, probably around our age. I didn't get a good look at him in the forest, but I did remember him quite well from my dream, so I was relying on that for my description. He was average height, with really beautiful caramel skin, golden eyes and dark hair about this long. I pointed to the spot at about shoulder length. Not particularly skinny, just lanky I guess. Now that I think about it, he was dressed quite lightly for the weather, thin pants and a t-shirt. He sounds pretty good-looking, she said with a smile and wiggled her eyebrows. I smirked. He kind of was. Why didn't you talk to him? Well, I didn't have a chance. He seemed to appear and disappear out of thin air, I said. She thought for a few moments. I've never seen anyone matching that description. I would have noticed him, she said with emphasis. Usually, we don't get strangers in those woods. That's what I thought, I exclaimed. It was strange, made me really wary, especially given how he just vanished. Nora took a careful look at me. Have you been sleeping well? She asked, and I knew she wasn't mocking me. She knew all too well that this time of year was hard for me. Last night was quite good, I said. Make sure you take it easy and get plenty of rest, especially this week. Yes, ma'am, I said mockingly. Nora liked to give orders around. I'm just worried about you, Kat. You know that, right? Nora was one of the few people who saw my struggles throughout all these years. I appreciate your care, I said and gave her a side hug as she still had her arm around my shoulder. And I promise to take good care of myself. Mom. She lightly slapped my shoulder. I complained, child abuse. Shut up, was her response. Dinner was quiet, as it usually was, during the week of my parents' death. Even Claire ate quietly, staring into her plate. It suited me. Throughout dinner, I kept throwing anxious glances towards the backyard. Nana noticed, of course. During one of my glances out the window, she asked with a hint of concern, "Is something the matter, dear? You keep looking out the window. Is something bothering you out there?" Although I was reluctant, I decided to ask my grandma whether she had heard anything similar since she had lived in this house for a big part of her life. Nana. Yesterday in the forest. I heard a strange noise, like a high-pitched sound that came from nowhere and disappeared abruptly, I said, not looking up. Surprisingly, Nana's voice sounded quite strained as she asked me, "What were you doing when you heard it?" My gaze jumped up. I was expecting her to brush it off in her usual easy manner. I was trying to meditate, I said hesitantly. I had my usual meeting with Miss Julie yesterday, and she suggested I give it a try as it might help me to deal with stuff. Meditating, Nana repeated slowly, nodding her head slightly as she did. Meditation is good for the mind, she said thoughtfully. And then she just stared at one spot for way too long. I could almost see thoughts churning in her mind. Abruptly, she stood up and briskly started to clean up the plates, even though we were barely done with the dinner. Oh dear, I forgot that I have the ladies' meeting tonight. So absent-minded of me, she muttered as she hurried around the kitchen. I looked at Nana, confused. It was unlike her to forget about scheduled events. It's okay, Nana, I can clean up, I offered, hoping to ease her frantic state. Oh, thank you, dear, she said, giving me a brief look before hurrying out of the kitchen. What was that? Asked Claire. I have no idea, I said, still staring at the door that Nana exited from. This wasn't Nana's usual behavior, she never rushed anywhere. She typically handled things in a deliberate, measured manner, as if everything was always planned out in her day. I suppose that solved my dilemma on whether I should attempt going to the forest again today. I couldn't leave Claire all by herself. With a sigh, I resigned myself to cleaning the kitchen. Later that evening, I grew more and more worried with every passing hour as I sat in my room trying to get through my homework, while at the same time listening for my grandma's return. Finally, I noticed Apollo perked up his ears, and a few moments later I heard the sound of tires on our driveway. I rushed downstairs with Apollo beside me. "Hey, Grandma," I greeted her as she opened the door. "Oh," she said, looking slightly startled before quickly fixing her expression with a smile. "How were the ladies?" I asked, watching her closely. "Oh, lovely, just lovely," she replied, slipping off her shoes without meeting my gaze. I kept on, determined to figure out whether my suspicions had any ground. "What were you doing?" "Oh, the usual," she said, still not looking at me. "Like what?" This situation was getting a bit funny, as if I was an adult trying to catch a teenager on a lie. "We played bridge," she said after a long moment. "You played bridge?" I repeated in disbelief. Nana hated bridge and would usually try her best to avoid bridge nights, and yet this evening she seemed like she couldn't get there fast enough. "Yes, Mary won as usual," she said as she rushed past me to her bedroom. I turned and looked towards the top of the staircase where my grandma disappeared. My face full of skepticism, I mumbled to myself, "You played bridge." With a snicker and a shake of my head, I decided that my grandma was a terrible liar.